Maps talk, and so does the landscape. This is part of the Deracialize the Dallas Landscape series, which is part of the Schwanee project. This is part of a series regarding repairing the landscape, concerning itself on how the landscape is named. There are other issues involved with landscape reparations which need to be addressed and are important, but this series will be about the identifiers on the landscape in the service of white supremacy. For more information about landscape reparations, go to http://landscape-reparations.html. Before proceeding, if you recognize the places or languages on some of these maps, please keep it to yourself. Given that we live in a diverse society, I have no doubt that some of you will recognize the languages and the places in the following maps. However, given that my lesson is about what a map tells you, even when you can't read it, and even when you don't know the language that it is in other cases, what the map tells you, even if you don't know where it is or recognize the names on it, it'll be spoiled for others if you tell people about the maps. Though most of you can't read this map, and many will guess the wrong language of this map, some of you will be able to read this map and some will know the language. The same map tells different things to different people. I'm going to discuss what this map will say to the great majority of Americans who are illiterate in this language and, to be frank, provincial, to discuss how maps talk. Even though you can't read this map, and you may even not know what language it is in, this map tells a lot. Without being able to read it, you know that it's largely populated by an Asian people, and you know that the selection of foods are different. You know that these people primarily speak an Asian language and likely have different literary traditions. You even know what eating utensils are used. As for the modern world, you know that they might have watched some American TV with subtitles. They likely have watched many TV series of which you have never heard. They likely have popular singers there of which you have never heard. If I told you my dentist knows this place and grew up near there, you would know what the color of his hair and eyes is likely to be, and know that he is Asian. You realize also, being there, you might not be able to speak to many of the people. You might wonder if you were there if you could find your way around, or would you risk getting lost? Would you know where the bus was going, or be able to find an address, driving a car? Your very relation to navigating geography is now in question. You know it is in a very different time zone, since it is in Asia. They are likely awake when you are sleeping and sleeping when you are awake. About this place, you also know that an Asian people is in charge of this space and name it. You wonder if the government is friendly to Americans. The map goes on, talking and talking as you contemplate it. Even though you can't read this map, you possibly don't even know the language of the map is talking to you. Consider this map. You can read it. You know wherever it is in the world, they are mostly English speaking, and it is likely to be in the Western world. You could list the nations where this might be. You can also realize that it's likely that this place has been English speaking for some time, since there aren't place names in another language. If you were there, you very likely could speak to the people living there. You wouldn't be that much afraid of getting lost and would feel comfortable navigating public transportation. The foods there would largely be the same, and there could be some different national foods. They would be ones you already knew about and had likely already tried. The television shows that the people there watch are likely to include many television shows you have watched also. and you have probably watched some of the shows produced there. The popular musicians and singers there are very likely to be popular where you are. You know that probably in school they have had to read Charles Dickens and Shakespeare. Maybe the history of the nation of that place was involved in the national history of your place, if it wasn't already your place. You would know wherever that place was why people have had a large say in the affairs of the nation. Even though you don't know where the place of this map is, you know a fair amount about this place. This map talks beyond giving directions. Very likely my pronunciations are wrong for the following map. A map can speak to a third party about who you are. I would likely pronounce names correctly on other landscapes in other languages, but I have no idea about the pronunciation of these names. Again, this map is going to say different things to different people, and it's going to say different things about you. You may not know which city this is, but you know it is a city in Africa. You see names like Mawanda Road, Upper Kolo Terrace, Sezibah Road, Kafu Road, Bukoto Street. You don't know what language they might be in, but you vaguely remember that these are the spellings of African words. Though if you have an interest in African studies, you likely know what language this is, which city this is, and that'll be very clear to you. Maps say different things to different people. The Malcolm X Boulevard tells you that they are conscious of the civil rights struggles in the United States. You can tell Africans are in charge of this place. Africans living there are not aliens of that place. It is their place. You can guess that some people are speaking English there, since the map shows the words upper, roads, streets, and avenues. There is perhaps some overlap in television shows. There are likely different popular television shows of which you have never heard. But you also know that the foods are likely to be different. Maybe there is an unofficial language which the people there use informally. Again, this map is providing information more than just navigation. This map is talking about the place. This is another view of the same city as before, but closer up. You can see there are still streets named after members of the British royal family. You now know that it is a former British colony, since there are many streets with English names. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that there was a scandal over judges at that place purchasing wigs to look like British judges with big white wigs they wear on their heads. You wonder if decolonization is complete. So just by looking at these names, I have speculations about how these people conceptualize themselves. How do they view their colonial past? I mean, I'm not informed, it's only a speculation, but it starts a chain of thoughts. And then there's probably some people, none of these questions would come to mind. They would not even think about these. Again, maps not only speak to you, but maps talk to other people about you. This is a hypothetical map of a hypothetical city with its streets named after racists and aggressors. Naming the vertical streets from right to left is Donald Trump Street, Theodore G. Bilbo Street. He was a notorious racist U.S. House rep in Mississippi who introduced legislation to ship all African Americans back to Africa. Stonewall Street, named after a Confederate general, Thomas Jackson. Louis Agassiz was a notorious racist anthropologist who argued that Africans were racially inferior. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. George Armstrong Custer waged war against Native Americans. Naming the horizontal streets from top to bottom: Forest Avenue, named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Thomas Dixon Jr., who wrote a series of racist novels, including The Klansman, and whose novels were adapted into the notorious racist movie Birth of a Nation. Charles E. Coughlin Avenue is named after an anti-Semitic broadcaster of the 1930s who attacked Jewish people. Strom Thurmond had a decades-long career campaigning against civil rights and ran for president in 1948 on the position of being opposed to civil rights and a defender of segregation. He's one of the more notorious racist figures of the 20th century. Aryan Street is for the Aryan white supremacists. The Red Shirts were a group of violent white terrorists who overthrew the South Carolina multiracial democracy in 1876. John C. Calhoun was a defender of slavery before the Civil War. Robert E. Lee was a Confederate general. He was also cruel to slaves. When some runaway slaves were recaptured, he had them whipped severely and brine poured into their wounds. The Diagonal Street is named after a racist pro-slavery theologian, R.L. Dabney. How would you feel visiting this city? Would you want to vacation there and stay overnight? What type of people do you imagine living there? If you are growing up there, what values would these street names teach a white person, teach a person who isn't white, or a Jewish person? What would you think would be the support for civil rights in the city? Would you consider moving there, or would you consider moving from there? What do you think the names of these streets tell white people about the value of the humanity of non-white people? What does this landscape tell non-white people about how their humanity is valued in that society? Viewing a landscape which makes non-white people the others in society, aliens, would there not be alienation? Do you think Black Lives Matter at all in this city? Who do you think is privileged in this city? Dallas actually has 4 of these streets. It has a Forest Avenue, a Stonewall Street, a Calhoun Avenue, and a Lee Parkway. Those 4 street names are still there because a committee of clowns known as the Confederate Task Force, working in conjunction with the city staff and the Dallas City Council, gave them a free pass. Actually, the streets of Dallas pretty much look like this city. The only difference is people here in Dallas don't know about the people for whom the streets are named. There's well over a dozen Confederate named streets. There are other streets named after other white supremacists. But when they had the Confederate Task Force, they didn't really want to know. This is a hypothetical set of street names in another hypothetical city. First, doing the vertical streets from right to left. Benjamin Lay was a very early American abolitionist who unfortunately is largely forgotten. Cujo was a leader of runaway slaves in Jamaica who fought the British slavers. Salvador Castro led the historic 1968 East Los Angeles school walkouts protesting unequal conditions and bias. Benito Juarez led the war against the French invaders of Mexico and drove them out. The French were supporters of the Confederacy. Samori Touré led resistance against the French colonization of West Africa. Horizontal streets from top to bottom. Michael Schwerner was one of the 3 civil rights workers killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964 by the Ku Klux Klan. James Reeb was a civil rights worker murdered in 1964 while participating in the historic Selma to Montgomery, Alabama Civil Rights March, and his death was mocked by William Buckley, the publisher of National Review. Sunki Whitko was a Native American leader who led the resistance against the American invasion of the Black Hills in South Dakota and defeated George Armstrong Custer. Nelson Mandela was an activist who was a leader in the effort to defeat apartheid in South Africa. Iwu is an African name which you might expect to see on a street if Africans came as immigrants and not as slaves that lost their identity and their names and had the opportunity to do something noteworthy, such so that a street would be named after them. Balogan Alley is named after Rakeem Balogan of Dallas, Texas, who was arrested in 2017 for his opinions in relation to police brutality in the United States. Viola Liuzzo was a civil rights activist murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in 1965. Bambatha Ka Maninza led an armed rebellion against the British poll tax in Natal, South Africa. The diagonal street is named Benin, a nation on the coast of West Africa. Many American cities have numerous streets named after places, cities, and nations in Europe. In this city, there's a street named after an African nation. How would you feel visiting this city? Would you want to vacation there and stay overnight? What type of people do you imagine living there? If you were growing up there, what values would these street names teach a white person, teach as someone who isn't white, or a Jewish person? What would you think would be the support for civil rights in this city? Would you consider moving there or moving from that city? Of the two imaginary cities, which do you think would be the better place to live, just by looking at the street names? Do you think Black Lives Matter in this city? Who do you think might be privileged there? Dallas would have had a Nelson Mandela Avenue except for the campaign by the Dallas Morning News opposing the name change, with the lead person at the Dallas Morning News being African-American editorial board member Jim Mitchell, with the support of African-American city council person Von Seal Hill. Between them and the concerted effort of the Dallas Morning News, the measure was defeated and the name was never changed. One thing about this map, which is very apparent, is that, unlike the map of the previous hypothetical city, I have trouble pronouncing correctly some of the names. This is because you don't see African names in the American landscape, and so I don't grow up hearing African names pronounced. This is because Africans came as enslaved, kidnapped victims, stripped of their family names, and not as immigrants, and lived under oppression. So there wasn't an opportunity to be land developers and name streets after their families, or achieve prominence in society to have streets named after them. The history of racist oppression in America is encoded into the naming of the landscape. I wasn't taught world history in school, but instead the history of Western civilization, in which the topic of the crimes of imperialism were avoided. So I didn't hear many African or other non-Western names taught. We are not taught in history the actual names of Native American leaders, but instead their names in translation. So I can say Crazy Horse, a translation of his name, but not his name in the Lakota language. People growing up with a white landscape with a racist curriculum will find the first streets with African and Native American names initially difficult to pronounce. They will seem strange, reinforcing the idea that people with these names are alien. This is what the landscape currently does, defines what's familiar and what is alien. Renaming the landscape will provide a corrective instruction in everyday life, so that after a while these names will become familiar, properly pronounced, and those who have names like this will be familiar and not alien. Streets which are a part of everyday experience have the power to make things familiar and a part of everyday life. This area of Virginia was built on the labor, the suffering, the toil, the blood of African slaves who, under the threat of the lash and their children being sold away, and other cruel punishments, or worked to exhaustion to build wealth for the slave owners and others who indirectly benefited from this wealth. Where is Africa on this map? It is nowhere. This map erases the African Americans who provided the wealth to build these cities. If you looked at the names of the streets in those cities, you wouldn't find African names either. Even though this landscape was built with African labor, the map and the names of places on the landscape erase Africans and make them the others in society. John H. Cochran, a prominent Dallas citizen, published a book in 1928 titled Dallas County, a record of its pioneers and progress. In this, he has a chapter about the Civil War. Cochran's history of Dallas was the history of which the white Dallas elite believed to be the history of Dallas. In 1966, a special reprinting was done by Aldrich Bookstore with a foreword written by popular Dallas Morning News columnist and historian Sam Atchison. I'm happy to report Aldrich Bookstore is no longer here, and one of Dallas's horcruxes of racism no longer exists. Dallas preservation societies aren't able to preserve every horcrux of racism, as much as they might try. In this book, he explains that Dallas County during the Civil War was a major source of food supplies for the Confederacy, and also was a major source of supplies in terms of arms and material for the military effort. Cochran explains how the city of Dallas so greatly enriched itself through war profiteering during the Civil War. I read from his book, "Besides, large numbers of Negroes were brought into Dallas County for food and for protection during the war, and were gladly hired to the citizens for their food and clothes. Nearly every family which had no Negroes of their own hired one or more of these Negroes and were thus enabled to cultivate all of their land in wheat, corn, and oats. So Dallas County continued to be the great food-producing center of Texas. Its reputation in this respect became so great that many desirable citizens were attracted by its prosperity and permanently settled in the county and contributed much to its future development." Notice that Cochran talks about African Americans being taken to Dallas County, quote unquote, for protection during the war. What he's saying in an oblique way, the African American slaves were brought to Dallas and brought to Texas so they wouldn't be emancipated by the advancing American armies during the Civil War. He's talking the protection is protection from emancipation. Notice how Microsoft has highlighted the word Negroes in Cochran's text for not being capitalized. It is my intent to show the past as it was and allow the reader to see the past in its entirety. Not capitalizing it was Cochran's choice, not mine. In summary, Dallas got its start with war profiteering during the Civil War by exploiting the slave labor brought to Dallas by slaveholders fleeing the American armies which were bringing emancipation. Dallas got its start glutted with war profits by exploiting refugee slaveholders' slave labor to support the Confederate war and effort to preserve slavery. Slave labor launched Dallas in this region of Texas, yet you won't find African names on the map. Africans are erased from the landscape. Their major role in the history of this region isn't represented. The names of the cities, as well as the names of the streets in these cities, do not represent Africans as part of the land, as part of the history of the land. The names on the landscape define Africans as the alien others. Dallas is just one example where the connection of the success of a city to slave labor is particularly pronounced. But many American cities owe their success to the slave trade and the products of slave labor bringing wealth to them. The city of Providence, Rhode Island, and other New England towns enriched themselves from the slave trade and the products of slave labor. The flow of wealth into many places in the United States came from slave labor. Yet in those cities in which this wealth has flowed into, one thing that has not flowed into them is Africanness, as seen on the landscape, in the names of the landscape. This is a close-up slide of the area around Dallas City Hall. It is selected as an example for closer inspection, but it isn't that much different than the streets in many cities. We don't see African names near City Hall. What we see are the names connected to slavery, white supremacy, and the Confederacy. Close examination of this map will show Maya Angelou High School. That is named by the Dallas Independent School District, not by the city of Dallas. Sometimes you have one governmental body moving forward further than another governmental body. If you tried to name a street after Maya Angelou in Dallas, it'd be like pulling teeth. Now, there will be some that will whine, "Oh, but there are some African American streets in Dallas." Let's look at that. This is a map of the dreams and visions of Elsie Faye Higgins, Marvin Crenshaw, and Dwayne Caraway. The streets would have run through Dallas at large, and these names would have been part of the everyday experience of Dallas persons of all races. But this is the reality. There is no Nelson Mandela Street. The streets are contained in the then African American community as if they are a biohazard. As that district gentrifies, it will be interesting to see if any of the names will be retained. Similarly, the Cesar Chavez Boulevard ended up being shoved onto a marginal side road out of prominent view when the Dallas Latino community was cheated out of what is now Riverfront Boulevard. Some tokenism doesn't mean it isn't still a white landscape. Marilla Young was the mother of Reverend William C. Young, slave owner who was in the Confederate Army and active in neo-Confederate groups after the Civil War, and an alderman in the 1870s in the city's white supremacist regime, and who celebrated the Confederate war criminal W.L. Cabell. Edward C. Broder was captain of Company C, 18th Texas Cavalry of the Confederate Army. Henry S. Irvay was a soldier in General Walker's filibuster expedition to make Nicaragua a slave state. He enlisted in Confederate service as an assistant quartermaster, but the street was named after him by Reverend Young for his role as mayor overthrowing Reconstruction and the final restoration of white supremacy in Dallas. Again, we have Reverend William C. Young, slave owner, who was in the Confederate Army and active in neo-Confederate groups after the Civil War, and an alderman in the 1870s in the city's white supremacist regime, and who celebrated the war criminal W.L. Cabell. Canton Street was named after a town in Trigg County, Kentucky, where Reverend W.C. Young was born. William Christopher Columbus Ackerd married into the slave-owning Bowen family and went with them as the Bowens fled with their slaves from Missouri to Arkansas and then to Dallas to escape the American armies that could bring freedom to their slaves. Dallas City Hall is surrounded by streets that honor white supremacists. How truthful is any talk about healing or reconciliation in regards to the issue of race by a city government that finds it acceptable to surround itself with streets that honor white supremacists? Cadiz Street was named after the county seat of Trigg County, Kentucky, where Reverend Young was born. Evergreen Street was named after a town in Conecuh County, Alabama, where Reverend Young's wife, Mary S.C. Pipkin Young, was born. Maps talk. They say, what are the values of the society which occupies the land? They say whose humanity is important and whose isn't. They say who is of the land and who is alien. What do we want our landscape to say about us? What our values are, who we are, who makes up the us when we say us? What do we want our landscape to say about whose humanity is important? We need to reflect on these questions and act accordingly, regardless what that might require or obstacles we might face. We need to repair the landscape. We need landscape reparations. I hope you give this matter some reflection. Thank you for your time.